The late afternoon sun slanted through the ancient oak trees that lined the sprawling grounds of Riverside Estate, casting dappled shadows across manicured lawns and splashing golden light onto the sea of white chairs arranged in perfect rows. A gentle June breeze carried the mingled scents of roses, peonies, and lilacs through the air, along with the delicate notes of a string quartet warming up in the distance. The sky was a flawless canvas of cerulean blue, unmarred by even a single cloud, exactly the weather that Elizabeth Morgan had prayed for since she'd selected this date 18 months ago. Beneath a vast canopy of interconnected white marquees, workers made final adjustments to floral arrangements that cascaded from tall silver stands. Each bloom had been meticulously selected: ivory roses, pale orchids, delicate baby's breath, and sprays of greenery, creating an atmosphere of ethereal elegance against the lush backdrop of Boston's most prestigious wedding venue. Crystal glassware captured and refracted the sunlight, sending prismatic rainbows dancing across crisp, white linen tablecloths. Silver chargers edged in gold awaited the carefully crafted dinner that would follow the ceremony. Everything gleamed with purpose and promise. Elizabeth Morgan stood in a private tent designated for the bridal party, her fingers nervously tracing the intricate beadwork of her wedding gown, a masterpiece of Duchess satin and French lace that had required 6 months of painstaking craftsmanship by artisans at a small atelier in Paris. The dress flowed like liquid moonlight around her slender frame, the bodice adorned with thousands of hand-sewn crystals that caught the light with every breath she took. At 28, Elizabeth had spent years imagining this moment, this dress, this day that was meant to be perfect. Her reflection stared back at her from a full-length mirror framed in antique gold. With her blonde hair swept into an elaborate updo adorned with pearl pins and a few strategically placed baby's breath blooms, she looked like she'd stepped from the pages of a high-end bridal magazine. Her makeup was flawless, subtle enough to appear natural, but skillful enough to enhance her blue eyes and high cheekbones. By all accounts, she was the picture-perfect bride. Yet the woman in the mirror looked back at her with eyes that held a shadow of uncertainty. "You're fidgeting again," her cousin Catherine said softly, adjusting the cathedral-length veil that pooled around Elizabeth's feet like morning mist. With her dark blonde bob and willowy frame, Catherine had always been Elizabeth's confidant, the steady presence who balanced Elizabeth's occasional flights of perfectionism. Today she wore a champagne-colored silk dress that complemented her olive complexion, a tasteful contrast to the bride's pristine white. "The guests can't see you yet, but they'll sense your anxiety if you don't calm down." Elizabeth exhaled slowly, her hands smoothing imaginary wrinkles from the impeccable satin. I know, I just keep thinking of all the things that could still go wrong. Did the florist remember the specific shade of white peonies for the cake table? Did someone check if grandmother's medication was packed in her purse? Is Matthew's Uncle Roger staying away from the open bar before the ceremony? Catherine laughed softly, her hands gentle on Elizabeth's shoulders as she turned her away from the mirror. "The peonies are perfect. Your mother personally checked grandmother's medication, and I saw Ryan assigning one of the groomsmen to babysit Uncle Roger. Everything is under control." Beneath the carefully applied makeup, Elizabeth could feel the shadows of sleepless nights spent finalizing details, mediating family disputes, and quieting her own persistent doubts. Not doubts about Matthew, never about him, but about the significance placed on this single day, the pressure for everything to be flawless. The weight of two prestigious Boston families joining in a union that the society pages had already dubbed the wedding of the decade. I just want everything to be perfect," Elizabeth whispered, her voice barely audible above the distant sounds of the string quartet transitioning to Bach. "After everything we've been through to get here, Catherine squeezed her shoulder gently. "And it will be. Look around you, this wedding is already the talk of Boston. People will remember this day for years." If only Catherine knew how prophetic those words would prove to be. Outside the bridal tent, beneath the sprawling canopy of interconnected marquees, Matthew Thornton adjusted his custom-tailored tuxedo. For the third time in as many minutes, the black Italian wool sat perfectly against his broad shoulders, but he couldn't shake the sensation that something was constricting his throat. Perhaps it was just the platinum collar pin, or perhaps it was the weight of what this day represented, not just a marriage, but the culmination of years navigating complex family politics and business pressures. At 32, Matthew had established himself as more than just the heir to the Thornton financial empire. He'd doubled the company's value since taking over as CEO 3 years ago, expanded their reach into sustainable investments, and earned the respect of competitors twice his age. Yet standing here about to marry the woman he loved in front of Boston's elite, he felt the same flutter of nerves he'd experienced before his first major presentation to the board. "Stop fidgeting," his best man Ryan muttered, straightening his own bow tie in a small handheld mirror. Ryan had been Matthew's roommate at Harvard and remained his closest friend through the tumultuous years that followed graduation. "You look like you're about to bolt." Matthew forced a smile, running a hand through his dark brown hair that had been meticulously styled that morning. "I'm not running anywhere, just making sure that everything's perfect for Elizabeth. The woman is marrying you, despite knowing all your terrible habits." Ryan quipped, "She's seen you with the flu, witnessed your disastrous attempt at cooking Thanksgiving dinner, and somehow still wants to spend her life with you. I'd say you're already ahead." Matthew's eyes scanned the assembled guests, over 300 of Boston's most prominent families seated in white chairs with gold ribbons tied at the backs. The men in perfectly tailored suits that whispered of wealth without shouting it. The women resplendent in designer dresses and tasteful jewelry that cost more than many people's annual salaries. The colors were reserved in elegant navy blues, soft grays, muted pinks, classic blacks, creating a tapestry of wealth and status against the white and gold decor that Elizabeth had selected. The string quartet played softly near the altar, a magnificent arch of intertwined white roses and greenery that had taken florists nearly 6 hours to assemble that morning. Beyond it stretched the expansive grounds of Riverside Estate, the Charles River gleaming in the distance through a canopy of ancient trees. It was by any standard idyllic. But as Matthew's gaze swept across the gathering, it snagged on a figure standing apart from the others. His older brother Andrew stood beneath a flowering dogwood tree, a tumbler of amber liquid already in hand, despite the early hour. Unlike the other guests who mingled and laughed, greeting each other with air kisses and firm handshakes, Andrew remained isolated, his expression unreadable behind dark designer sunglasses. The sight sent a cold current down Matthew's spine. He hadn't wanted Andrew at the wedding, not after everything that had happened between them, but their father had insisted, "Family is family," William Thornton had said with finality, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had built their family's fortune across generations. "Whatever grievances exist between you boys must be set aside for this day." Easy for him to say William hadn't been the one betrayed. He hadn't discovered his brother secretly meeting with their biggest competitor, hadn't uncovered the paper trail that showed Andrew had nearly sabotaged a merger that took 2 years to negotiate. He hadn't been the one forced to bring evidence of his own brother's disloyalty to their father, watching as William's face transformed from disbelief to devastation to cold anger. "Is that Andrew?" Ryan asked, following Matthew's gaze. "I thought he was still in New York." "He was," Matthew replied, his voice tight. "Came back yesterday, father's wishes." Ryan whistled low. 3 years without a word, and he shows up to your wedding like nothing happened. That's cold." "That's Andrew," Matthew said simply, forcing himself to look away from his brother. He wouldn't let Andrew's presence cast a shadow over today. Not when Elizabeth had worked so hard to make everything perfect. Not when they'd waited so long for this day to arrive. His attention was drawn to movement near the back of the garden. A large German shepherd with a rich sable coat being secured to a decorative post by one of the security staff. Duke had been Matthew's companion for 6 years, a gift from his late mother before her passing. The dog had an almost supernatural intuition, sensing Matthew's moods before even he was aware of them. Today, however, Duke seemed unusually alert, His ears pricked forward as he surveyed the crowd, his posture rigid instead of relaxed. "Why is Duke restless?" Matthew murmured more to himself than to Ryan. "Probably all the excitement," Ryan replied with a shrug. "Or maybe he senses your nerves. Dogs pick up on that stuff, right?" Before Matthew could respond, the string quartet transitioned to a new melody, a signal that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests quickly found their seats, a sea of expectant faces, turning toward the floral arch where Reverend Mills waited, Bible in hand. Matthew took his position, straightening his shoulders and willing his heartbeat to slow. This was his wedding day. Nothing would go wrong. Nothing could go wrong. He had never been more mistaken. The ceremony began with the traditional procession bridesmaids in floor-length gowns the color of champagne, their bouquets echoing the ivory and blush palette that dominated the decor. The groomsmen followed each in a black tuxedo, identical to Matthew's, save for their slightly less elaborate boutonnieres. The flower girls, twin nieces of Elizabeth, scattered rose petals along the white satin runner, their cherubic faces beaming with importance as guests murmured appreciatively at their matching lace dresses. Elizabeth's father, Richard Morgan, stood waiting at the entrance to the aisle, his silver hair gleaming in the sunlight, his posture military straight despite his 70 years. As chairman of Morgan Investment Group, he commanded respect in both financial and social circles, but today his normally stern expression had softened, betraying the emotion of giving away his only daughter. And then came Elizabeth. The collective intake of breath from the assembled guests was audible as she appeared at the end of the aisle on her father's arm. Her gown caught the late afternoon sunlight, the thousands of crystals creating an aura of shimmering radiance around her. Her face partially obscured by the delicate veil bore an expression of cautious joy, the look of a woman who had planned for this moment, but still couldn't quite believe it had arrived. As she moved slowly toward him, Matthew felt a surge of emotion so powerful it nearly drove him to his knees. This beautiful, brilliant woman had chosen him, had fought alongside him through family objections and business crises. She had stood firm when his brother's betrayal had nearly destroyed everything they'd built together, had believed in him when self-doubt threatened to undermine his confidence. Elizabeth, with her sharp mind and soft heart, who could demolish an opponent in the courtroom where she worked as a corporate attorney and then spend her weekend volunteering at an animal shelter. Elizabeth, who laughed at his terrible jokes and called him on his occasional arrogance. Elizabeth, who knew all his flaws and loved him anyway. When she finally reached him at the altar when her father placed her hand in his, with the traditional blessing, Matthew's voice failed him momentarily. "You're breathtaking," he finally managed to whisper. Elizabeth's smile deepened, revealing the subtle dimple in her right cheek. "So are you," she whispered back, giving his hand a gentle squeeze. Up close, he could see the faint glimmer of tears in her eyes, threatening to spill, but held in check by what he knew was an iron will to maintain her carefully applied makeup. Reverend Mills began the ceremony, his rich baritone carrying across the garden, as he spoke of commitment, of partnership, of love that endures through trials and tribulations. The words washed over Matthew in waves, their significance momentarily dulled by the overwhelming reality of Elizabeth standing beside him. Hachiriyar, marriage. The Reverend intoned, is not entered into lightly but with careful consideration and respect for its sacred nature. It is a union that joins not just two people, but two families, two histories, two futures. Matthew felt, rather than saw his father shift slightly in the front row. William Thornton sat rigid in his seat, his face a mask of appropriate emotion, his eyes occasionally drifting to where Andrew stood apart from the seated guests, still nursing his drink. William had always been a man who valued appearance above all else, the appearance of success, of family unity, of control. Today was no exception, even if the unity on display was more fragile than anyone knew. The vows came next, traditional promises interspersed with personal declarations they had written for each other. Matthew spoke of Elizabeth's strength, her unwavering support during the darkest days of the family business crisis, her ability to see the best in him, even when he couldn't see it himself. His voice grew husky with emotion as he promised to cherish her, to respect her independence while creating a life of shared purpose, to face whatever challenges arose together rather than alone. Elizabeth, in turn, honored Matthew's integrity. His refusal to compromise his principles, even when doing so would have been easier. She spoke of his kindness, his dedication not just to success, but to meaning his ability to make her feel simultaneously protected and empowered. Her voice remained steady, though a single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek as she pledged her life and love to him. The exchange of rings followed platinum bands engraved with their initials and the date on the inner surface. Matthew's hands trembled slightly as he slid the delicate band onto Elizabeth's slender finger, the weight of the moment suddenly overwhelming. This wasn't just a ceremony, wasn't just a social event to be documented in the Boston Globe's society pages. This was the beginning of a shared life, a promise made not just to Elizabeth, but to himself to be the man she deserved. Everything was perfect. Everything was unfolding exactly as planned. Until it wasn't. As Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, as he invited Matthew to kiss his bride, a sharp, urgent bark cut through the music and murmured appreciation of the crowd. Then another and another. Heads turned toward the sound. Duke, normally so well-behaved, was barking, frantically straining against his leash, his body rigid with what appeared to be alarm. The security staff member who had been assigned to watch him was attempting to quiet him, but the dog's barks only grew more frantic, more insistent. "What on earth?" Victoria Morgan, Elizabeth's mother, hissed from the front row. The meticulously crafted facade of serenity she had maintained throughout the ceremony cracked, revealing the iron will beneath her perfectly coiffed silver blonde hair, remained immobile despite her agitation, a testament to the expensive salon treatment she'd undergone that morning. "Someone control that animal immediately." One of the security personnel hurried over to Duke, attempting to quiet him, but the dog only grew more agitated. His bark shifted to a low, menacing growl, his gaze fixed on something across the garden. Matthew followed the dog's line of sight, confusion furrowing his brow. Duke was staring at the reception area, specifically at the elaborate wedding cake that stood as the centerpiece of the celebration. The masterpiece rose nearly 5 feet tall, a triumph of architectural confectionery, with 4 tiers of vanilla Genoese sponge covered in smooth white fondant and decorated with sugar flowers that mimicked the real blooms adorning the tables. It had been displayed on a raised platform surrounded by cascading white roses and twinkling fairy lights, positioned so that guests could admire it throughout the reception. "Matthew," Elizabeth whispered, her fingers digging into his arm. The perfect moment, their first kiss as husband and wife, had vanished, replaced by confusion and growing dismay. "What's wrong with Duke?" "I don't know," he replied, a strange unease settling over him. In 6 years, he had never seen Duke behave this way without cause. The dog was trained disciplined. He didn't bark at shadows or react to nothing. Duke had the temperament of a therapy dog, most days calm and steady, even in chaotic environments. This behavior was so out of character that it sent a chill down Matthew's spine. The confused murmurs of the guests grew louder. Some exchanged glances of annoyance while others looked concerned. The perfect ceremony, their perfect moment, was disintegrating before their eyes. "Someone do something about that dog," Victoria demanded, rising from her seat. Her pale blue designer dress, selected to complement but not compete with the bridal party, rustled with indignation. "This is completely unacceptable." William Thornton frowned, his deep-set eyes narrowing as he observed the scene. Unlike his wife, who had passed away 3 years prior, he had never been particularly fond of the dog, considering it an unnecessary indulgence. But even he recognized that Duke's behavior was unusual. "Perhaps the animal senses something we don't," he suggested, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had made him one of Boston's most successful businessmen. Victoria scoffed. "The only thing that dog senses is that it's getting too much attention." "Matthew, please, this is ruining my daughter's moment." But Matthew was already moving, striding toward Duke, with Elizabeth still clutching his arm. The guests parted before them, whispers trailing in their wake. The perfect choreography of the day was unraveling, and Matthew could feel Elizabeth's distress in the trembling of her hand against his sleeve. When they reached Duke, the dog's behavior shifted. He stopped barking and instead whined, looking up at Matthew with an urgency that sent chills down his spine. Then Duke turned his gaze back to the wedding cake, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Matthew knelt beside the dog, one hand stroking his head. "What are you trying to tell me?" "He's telling us something's wrong with that cake," came a voice from behind them. Matthew turned to see his father's sister, Aunt Eleanor, approaching with the measured grace that had made her both respected and feared within the family. Unlike her brother William, who had embraced Boston's high society with its emphasis on appearance and connections, Eleanor had chosen a different path. After a successful career as a professor of cultural anthropology at Harvard, she had retired to a small farm in Vermont, where she raised honeybees and wrote monographs that were still required reading in many university programs. Her emerald green dress was elegant but simpler than those of most female guests, and her silver hair was styled in a practical bob rather than an elaborate updo. "Dogs sense things we cannot." Eleanor continued, her eyes sharp beneath heavily lined lids. "In the country, we know to listen when animals give warnings." Victoria, who had followed them, made no attempt to hide her eye roll. Her relationship with Eleanor had always been strained, the two women representing opposite approaches to wealth and status. "Please, Eleanor, spare us your country's superstitions. This is Boston in 2023, not some rural backwater where people still consult psychics." "It's me, you. Mock all you want," Eleanor replied calmly. "But wisdom doesn't become foolishness simply because it's old. That dog is trying to warn us." Claire, Matthew's cousin and Elizabeth's closest friend, pushed through the gathering crowd. Unlike most of the female guests who wore pastels or jewel tones, Claire had opted for a sleek modern gown in deep burgundy that complemented her short blonde hair. As an environmental lawyer working for a nonprofit, she often served as the family's social conscience, challenging the Thornton wealth to serve broader purposes than mere accumulation. "I agree with Aunt Eleanor," she said, her eyes on Duke. "Matthew, when has Duke ever raised a false alarm? Never. That's when I think we should take this seriously." The crowd had grown now, guests abandoning their seats to cluster around the unfolding drama. Some watched with concern, others with barely concealed delight at the prospect of scandal at Boston's wedding of the year. Matthew caught sight of Andrew, who had moved closer but still remained at the periphery, his expression hidden behind those dark glasses, but his posture suggesting a strange alertness that hadn't been there before. "Take what seriously?" Victoria demanded, her voice rising with indignation. "A barking dog? Are we really going to disrupt my daughter's wedding because an animal made noise?" Elizabeth, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. "If something's wrong, I want to know." Her voice was soft but firm, the same tone she used in courtrooms when establishing a point that could not be refuted. "I'd rather pause now than regret ignoring a warning." Victoria stared at her daughter in disbelief. "Elizabeth, I didn't raise you to be superstitious. It's not superstition, Mom. It's caution." Elizabeth turned to Matthew, her blue eyes searching his face. "What do you think?" Matthew hesitated, torn between his instinct to trust Duke and his desire not to further disrupt the carefully planned celebration. The rational part of his mind, the part trained at Harvard Business School to assess risks and benefits, told him this was absurd, that a dog's behavior was not sufficient reason to derail a wedding. But another part, the part that had trusted Duke's instincts on numerous occasions, whispered that something was very wrong. Before he could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "If I may offer a suggestion," the crowd parted to reveal Dr. James Wilson, Matthew's friend from college, and now a respected physician at Massachusetts General Hospital. He moved with professional confidence, his tailored suit marking him as part of Boston's medical elite, but his manner was approachable, free of the pretension that characterized many in their social circle. "I have some testing equipment in my car," he continued, his voice calm and rational. "Simple chemical tests that might put everyone's mind at ease. If there's nothing wrong with the cake, we can continue the celebration, knowing it was just an overexcited dog. If there is something amiss, He left the sentence unfinished, but his meaning was clear. "This is absurd," Victoria protested, looking around for support. "You want to subject my daughter's wedding cake to chemical tests because a dog barked? What's next, consulting star charts before we serve dinner? I think it's a reasonable precaution." William Thornton set his tone, making it clear the matter was decided. As the patriarch of the Thornton family and the primary financier of the wedding, his word carried substantial weight, even with his daughter-in-law's family. "James, please fetch your equipment." As James hurried away, an uncomfortable silence fell over the gathering. Guests exchanged worried glances, and Elizabeth leaned against Matthew, the weight of her elaborate gown suddenly seeming too much to bear. What should have been their first moments as husband and wife were instead being overshadowed by growing unease. "It's going to be fine," Matthew whispered, though the knot in his stomach tightened with each passing moment. "Probably nothing." Duke had quieted somewhat but remained alert, his eyes never leaving the cake. The dog's certainty was unnerving, as if he knew something terrible was about to happen. James returned quickly, carrying a small black medical bag. The crowd parted again to let him approach the cake. Sarah, the bakery owner, who had created the confectionery masterpiece, hovered nearby, her expression a mixture of indignation and fear. "I don't understand," Sarah said, her voice shaking. She was a small woman in her 40s who had built her reputation creating desserts for Boston's elite, her bakery having won national recognition for its artistry. "I made this cake myself. Every ingredient was fresh, every tool sanitized. There can't be anything wrong with it." "I'm sure you're right," James said soothingly. "This is just a precaution." With careful movements, he extracted a thin slice from the bottom tier of the cake, placing it on a small glass dish he'd produced from his bag. The white fondant gave way to reveal layers of moist vanilla sponge separated by delicate buttercream. From his medical bag, he produced several vials and testing strips, working with the precision that had made him one of Boston's most sought-after physicians. The crowd watched in tense silence as James applied clear liquid to the cake sample, then dipped a test strip into the mixture. For a moment, nothing happened. Then before their eyes, the strip changed color, dramatically turning from pale yellow to an alarming dark purple. James's expression hardened. "This is impossible," he muttered, repeating the test with a fresh sample and a new strip. The result was the same, an immediate color change, indicating the presence of something that should never be in a wedding cake. "What is it?" Matthew demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What did you find, etc.?" James looked up, his face grave. "Cyanide," he said simply. "There's cyanide in the cake." The word fell like a stone into still water, sending ripples of shock through the assembled guests. Someone gasped, another person cursed. Sarah stumbled backward, her hand flying to her mouth. "No," she whispered, "no, that's not possible. I would never." "I didn't." "Poison," Victoria said, her voice hollow with disbelief. "Someone put poison in my daughter's wedding cake." Elizabeth swayed, her face draining of color beneath her makeup. Matthew caught her, his arm encircling her waist, anchoring her against the wave of realization that crashed over them both. "Who would do this?" Elizabeth whispered, her voice breaking. "Who would want to hurt us like this?" As the question hung in the air, Matthew's gaze drifted across the shocked faces of their guests until it landed on his brother. Andrew stood apart from the crowd, still and watchful, his expression unreadable behind those dark glasses. But there was something in his posture, a tension, a stillness that sent a chill down Matthew's spine. Would his own brother truly go this far? The perfect wedding had transformed into a nightmare. And as Duke's warning growl continued, Matthew knew with devastating certainty that this was only the beginning. The garden, once a scene of celebration, now bristled with tension. Security personnel had cordoned off the cake, and guests huddled in small groups, their voices a low hum of shock and speculation. The string quartet had long since ceased playing their instruments, abandoned on chairs as the musicians joined the stunned onlookers. Dr. Wilson worked methodically, testing samples from each tier of the cake. His findings confirmed their worst fears. Every layer contained traces of cyanide, not just in the frosting, but baked into the sponge itself. Someone had deliberately, systematically poisoned the entire wedding cake. "This wasn't an accident," James said grimly, disposing of his testing materials in a sealed biohazard bag. "The poison is evenly distributed throughout the cake. Someone knew exactly what they were doing." Matthew stood with his arm around Elizabeth, who had not spoken since the initial discovery. She seemed smaller, somehow diminished by the magnitude of what had happened. Her perfect day, the culmination of months of planning and years of dreaming, had been deliberately targeted. "I don't understand," Sarah repeated, tears streaming down her face, smudging the careful makeup she'd applied for this prestigious event. "I made this cake with my own hands. I tasted the batter myself just this morning. Before applying the fondant, I would have noticed if something was wrong. Then someone tampered with it after it left your kitchen." Claire said, her practical nature asserting itself through the chaos. Though she was more often found arguing environmental cases in court than attending society weddings, her analytical mind made her a stabilizing presence in crisis. "When did you deliver the cake?" "Around noon," Sarah replied, wiping at her tears with a handkerchief offered by one of the waitstaff. "I set it up myself on that platform. It was perfect. I swear it was perfect." "And did you stay with it the entire time?" James asked, his tone professional but not accusatory. Sarah's expression crumpled further. "No," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had to help with the dessert table arrangement. I was gone for maybe 20 minutes. But the cake was in the reception area and there were staff everywhere. How could someone poison it without being seen? Someone who knew what they were doing." William Thornton said, his deep voice resonating with anger. He had moved to stand near Matthew, his normally reserved demeanor giving way to a controlled fury that made those around him step back. Someone who had planned this carefully. Victoria, who had been unusually quiet since the discovery, suddenly surged forward. Her initial disbelief had transformed into righteous indignation, her social training momentarily forgotten in the face of such a personal attack. "This is sabotage," she declared, her voice rising above the murmurs of the crowd. "Someone deliberately targeted my daughter's wedding. I want answers, and I want them now." Aunt Eleanor moved to Elizabeth's side, her presence a steady anchor amid the swirling emotions. Unlike Victoria's theatrical outrage, Eleanor's anger was cold and focused. "The first question," she said calmly, "is not how, but why. Who would benefit from ruining this marriage celebration? Who would be desperate enough to resort to poison? All eyes turned to Matthew, the unspoken question hanging in the air. As CEO of Thornton Investments, one of New England's largest financial firms, he had no shortage of business rivals. The firm's recent expansion into sustainable energy had disrupted established interests, creating enemies among more traditional investors. But this felt different, more personal, more intimate than corporate sabotage. "I can think of business competitors," Matthew said slowly, his legal training helping him maintain composure, despite the turmoil in his mind. "But this feels like someone who knows us, someone who wanted to hurt us specifically, not just disrupt a business deal, or someone who wanted to hurt you through Elizabeth." Claire suggested, her gaze sharp as it swept over the gathered guests. "Someone who knows how much she means to you." A heavy silence followed her words. Matthew felt Elizabeth tense beside him, her fingers digging into his arm. Though she had yet to speak, he could sense her mind working, connecting dots, forming the same suspicion that had taken root in his own thoughts. "Matthew," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "do you think could it be Andrew?" The question he'd been asking himself since the moment James announced his findings, the question he didn't want to face. "I don't know," he replied honestly. "I want to say no, but the timing of his return is suspicious." Claire finished for him. 3 years of silence, and he shows up the day before your wedding. That's not coincidence." William Thornton frowned deeply, the lines in his face carving deeper with concern. Though he had distanced himself from his elder son after the business betrayal, Accusing Andrew of such a heinous act was clearly painful for him to contemplate. "Andrew is my son," he said heavily. "Whatever disagreements exist between you boys, accusing him of attempted murder is a serious matter." "Is that what this was?" Victoria demanded, her voice rising again. "An attempt on my daughter's life." James cleared his throat delicately. "The amount of cyanide I detected would certainly cause serious illness, potentially fatal, depending on how much was consumed and the individual's body weight. This wasn't a prank. It was deliberate harm." The reality of the situation crashed over them anew. This wasn't just sabotage. It was potentially attempted murder. The elegant wedding had transformed into a crime scene, the assembled guests now witnesses to a malevolence none of them had anticipated when donning their finery that morning. "Where is Andrew now?" Matthew asked, suddenly scanning the crowd. "Has anyone seen him?" Guests glanced around, murmuring among themselves, but no one could recall seeing Andrew since the commotion began. His absence, once noted, seemed damning. "Someone find him!" William commanded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Bring him here. We will settle this matter now." As security personnel dispersed to search for Andrew, Duke's behavior changed again. The dog's attention shifted from the cake to the periphery of the garden. His ears pricked forward, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Matthew asked, following Duke's gaze. At the far edge of the property, a figure moved in the shadows of the dogwood trees. Even from a distance, Matthew recognized the distinctive posture of his brother. Andrew wasn't fleeing. He was watching, observing the chaos from a safe distance, like a scientist monitoring an experiment. Without a word, Matthew released Elizabeth and strode toward his brother, years of suppressed anger rising like a tide within him. Guests scrambled out of his path, sensing the dangerous energy that emanated from him. Duke followed at his heels, still growling low in his throat. Andrew didn't retreat as Matthew approached. Instead, he removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes that were identical to Matthew's own, pale blue, intelligent, and currently filled with something that might have been amusement. "Hello, little brother," Andrew said smoothly. "Your wedding seems to have hit a snag." Matthew's control shattered. He lunged forward, grabbing Andrew by the lapels of his expensive suit and slamming him against the trunk of the dogwood tree. White blossoms rained down around them as the tree shuddered with the impact. "Did you do it?" Matthew demanded, his voice a harsh whisper. "Did you poison my wedding cake? Were you trying to kill me? Kill Elizabeth?" Andrew's expression remained infuriatingly calm. "Such dramatics," he replied, "and such serious accusations. Do you have any proof, or is this just another example of your tendency to jump to conclusions? Answer the question," Matthew growled, tightening his grip on the fine Italian fabric of Andrew's suit. "No." Andrew said simply, "I didn't poison your cake, though I can't say I'm entirely disappointed that someone did. It's quite the spectacle, isn't it? Boston's golden couple humiliated on their perfect day." Matthew's fist clenched, trembling with the effort it took not to strike his brother. "If I find out you're lying, you'll—" "What?" Andrew challenged, his composure finally cracking to reveal the bitterness beneath. "Take something else from me. There's nothing left for you to take. Little brother, you've already claimed everything that should have been mine. Is that what this is about, the company? After all these years, you're still throwing a tantrum because father chose me to lead Thornton Investments?" Andrew's laugh was cold. "A tantrum, is that what you call it when your birthright is stolen? When your own father passes you over for a younger son who's barely proven himself? You were handed everything, Matthew. Everything I worked for, everything I deserved. You abandoned the company." Matthew shot back memories of sleepless nights spent salvaging deals and reassuring clients flooding back. "You left for New York without a word, left me to pick up the pieces of the merger you destroyed. Father didn't choose me over you. You eliminated yourself from consideration when you betrayed the family's trust." Their confrontation was interrupted by William Thornton's commanding presence. He approached with the regal bearing that had intimidated business opponents for decades, Aunt Eleanor and Claire flanking him like sentinels. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "This is neither the time nor the place for old grievances. Andrew, did you have anything to do with what happened today?" Andrew straightened his jacket where Matthew's grip had wrinkled it, his movements deliberately casual despite the gravity of the situation. "No, father," he said, his voice regaining its smooth tone. "I may have issues with my brother, but I wouldn't resort to poisoning. That's a bit extreme, even for family drama, don't you think?" Something in his tone, a slight inflection, a hint of mockery made Matthew's skin crawl. He didn't believe his brother, not for a second. But before he could say anything, Claire stepped forward. "If you're innocent," she said, her voice cool, "then you won't mind if Dr. Wilson tests your hands for traces of cyanide. The person who handled the poison would likely have residue even if they wore gloves." Andrew's smile faltered momentarily, a flash of something concerned fear crossing his features, before the mask of indifference slipped back into place. "You want to test me? Based on what evidence?" "Based on motive," Claire replied without hesitation. "An opportunity. You've been at the venue all day, you have a history of conflict with Matthew, and you're the only one who doesn't seem particularly bothered by what's happened. Donna, this is ridiculous." Andrew scoffed, but there was a new tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there before. His right hand moved to his pocket, then away, a nervous gesture that Matthew recognized from childhood. Andrew's tell when he was backed into a corner. "If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear," Aunt Eleanor said, her piercing gaze fixed on her nephew. "A simple test, Andrew. That's all." For a long moment, it seemed Andrew might refuse. His eyes darted from face to face, calculating odds, weighing options. The businessman's mind still sharp, despite 3 years away from the corporate world. Then, with an elaborate shrug clearly meant to convey indifference, he extended his hands. "Fine, test away. But when this little drama concludes with my innocence proven, I expect an apology from all of you." Dr. Wilson approached cautiously, his testing kit ready. With methodical precision, he swabbed Andrew's hands, paying particular attention to the areas beneath the nails and between the fingers. Each sample was carefully labeled and tested on the spot. The silence as they waited for the results was suffocating. Matthew found himself holding his breath, his gaze locked on his brother's face. Andrew maintained his mask of amused indifference. But Matthew, who had grown up studying his older brothers, every expression caught the slight tightening around his eyes that had given away Andrew's bluff since childhood. James worked in silence, his expression professionally neutral. When he finally looked up from the test, his face was grim. "There are traces of cyanide," he announced quietly, faint but unmistakable. The words fell like a physical blow. Matthew staggered slightly, the confirmation of his worst suspicions, leaving him momentarily unsteady. William closed his eyes briefly, pain etching deeper lines into his weathered face. Though he had distanced himself from Andrew professionally, this personal betrayal seemed to age him a decade in moments. "That's impossible," Andrew protested, but the conviction had drained from his voice. "I never touched that cake. Someone is setting me up." "Who would set you up, Andrew?" Claire challenged. "Who even knew you would be here? You've been in New York for 3 years. Most people thought you wouldn't show up at all." "This isn't conclusive," Andrew insisted, a note of desperation creeping into his voice. "I could have picked up traces from somewhere else. Maybe someone contaminated my drink, or—" "Stop," William commanded, his voice like a whip. "Stop lying. Andrew, it's over." The finality in his father's tone seemed to break something in Andrew. His carefully constructed facade crumbled, revealing the raw anger beneath his shoulders, slumped, then tensed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "Fine," he spat. "You want the truth. Yes, I had the cake poisoned. Yes, I wanted to ruin your perfect day, Matthew. I wanted you to feel even a fraction of the humiliation I've felt for years." The admission, though expected, still struck Matthew like a physical blow. The confirmation that his own brother, his flesh and blood, had orchestrated something so cruel, so potentially deadly, was almost impossible to process. "You could have killed people," he said, disbelief coloring his voice, "all because of your wounded pride. It wasn't meant to be lethal." Andrew shot back, though the defensive tone suggested even he recognized the weakness of this justification. Just enough to make everyone violently ill enough to turn your fairy tale wedding into a disaster that no one would ever forget. The great Matthew Thornton brought low on his wedding day. The naked hatred in his brother's voice stunned Matthew. He had known there was resentment, bitterness even, but this level of malice, this deliberate cruelty was beyond anything he had imagined. "What do?" he asked simply. "What did I ever do to deserve this from you?" "You existed," Andrew replied, his voice suddenly weary. "You were born, and from that moment you were all that mattered. Mother doted on you. Father groomed you. Everyone looked at you and saw the future, while they looked at me and saw what the spare, the backup plan." He laughed bitterly. "And then when Father had to choose who would lead the company into its next phase, he chose you, despite my years of sacrifice, despite my experience. Because you've always been the favorite. Always." The raw pain beneath the words made Matthew's chest ache. Had it really been like that? Had he truly been oblivious to his brother's suffering for all these years? Memories flashed through his mind. Andrew teaching him to ride a bike. Andrew helping him with college applications. Andrew standing proud at his Harvard graduation. When had that brotherly bond dissolved into such toxic resentment? Before he could respond, security personnel arrived, summoned by Claire's discreet text message during the confrontation. They flanked Andrew, their presence a silent statement that this was no longer a family matter but a criminal one. Andrew Thornton, the head of security, said formally, "You'll need to come with us. The police have been called." Andrew didn't resist as they took his arms. He merely looked at his father, a strange smile playing at his lips. "Are you going to let them arrest your firstborn son, Father? Will you let the Thornton name be dragged through the mud in a public trial?" William's face was a mask of stone, but his eyes betrayed his pain. The Thornton name had been synonymous with integrity in New England financial circles for generations. A public scandal involving attempted poisoning would undoubtedly damage the reputation he had worked his entire life to maintain. For a moment, Matthew wondered if his father might intervene, might try to handle this internally, as he had so many other family crises, but William surprised him. "You stopped being my son the moment you decided to harm innocent people," he said, his voice heavy with finality. "Take him away." As security led Andrew toward the exit, he looked back once, his gaze finding Matthew's. "Congratulations on your wedding, little brother." He called that strange smile still in place. "I hope you'll remember it forever. I know I will." And then he was gone, leaving behind a silence so profound it seemed to have physical weight. Matthew stood motionless, trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. His own brother had attempted to poison his wedding guests, all to satisfy a grudge that had festered for years. A warm presence at his side pulled him from his thoughts. Elizabeth had followed the confrontation and now stood beside him, her hands seeking his. Her wedding gown, once pristine, now bore smudges of dirt at the hem, and her carefully styled hair had begun to come loose. But her eyes, when they met his, held no accusation, only concern. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Such a simple question, yet so impossibly complex to answer. Was he okay? Could anyone be okay after discovering such betrayal? "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I don't think I will be for a while." She nodded, understanding in her eyes. "Neither will I, but we'll face it together." She squeezed his hand gently. That's what today was supposed to be about. Wasn't it, facing life together, no matter what comes our way? Despite everything, the shock, the betrayal, the lingering horror of what might have happened, Matthew felt something warm unfurl in his chest. This remarkable woman, who had every right to blame him for the disaster their wedding had become, was instead offering strength partnership. "I'm so sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "This should have been the happiest day of your life, and instead we learned something important." She interrupted gently. "We learned that we can face crisis together. That's not a bad foundation for a marriage, is it?" Before he could respond, Duke pressed against his leg, looking up with an expression that seemed almost human in its concern. Matthew knelt, burying his fingers in the dog's thick fur. "You saved us," he murmured. "You knew something was wrong when none of us did." Elizabeth joined him, her elaborate gown pulling around her as she knelt to embrace the dog. "Our hero," she said softly, pressing her face against Duke's neck. The dog whined softly, licking her cheek as if to comfort her. As they comforted the dog and each other, the reality of what had nearly happened and what had been averted washed over Matthew anew. Without Duke's warning, guests would have eaten that cake. People might have died or, at the very least, suffered terribly. His brother's revenge would have been complete. "What happens now?" he asked, not entirely sure who he was asking. Elizabeth, his father, the universe itself. It was Aunt Eleanor who answered, approaching with the quiet dignity that had always been her hallmark. "Now," she said, "you decide what kind of beginning this will be. Every marriage has its first challenge. Yours has simply come earlier than most." She extended her hands to both of them, helping them to their feet. "The question is not what has happened, but what you will do with what has happened. Will you let this poison more than just a cake, or will you find strength in surviving it together?" Her words hung in the air, a challenge and a blessing intertwined. Matthew looked at Elizabeth, searching her face for an answer. What he found there, resilience, determination, and unwavering love, gave him the courage to straighten his shoulders and face what came next. "We move forward, he said firmly, together." Elizabeth's smile, though tinged with sadness, was genuine. "Together," she agreed. As they turned to face their guest to begin the painful process of explanation and reassurance, Matthew knew that this day would indeed be remembered not as the perfect celebration they had planned, but as the day they discovered the depth of their strength as a couple. It wasn't the beginning they had wanted, but perhaps it was the beginning they needed. With Elizabeth's hand firmly in his and Duke at their side, they stepped forward to reclaim their day from the shadow of betrayal. The setting sun cast long shadows across the garden, painting the white tents with hues of amber and gold. Most of the guests had departed, leaving behind an eerie quiet punctuated by the occasional rustle as workers began dismantling the elaborate decorations. The perfect wedding had ended not with joyous celebration, but with police statements and shocked whispers. Elizabeth sat on a gilt chair that had been part of the ceremonial setup, her magnificent gown spread around her, like the petals of a wilting flower. Her veil had been removed, and her elaborately styled hair now fell in soft waves around her shoulders. The expensive pins that had held it in place nestled in her palm like fallen stars. She stared at the pins, each one topped with a tiny pearl, remembering how her mother had helped secure them that morning. Each placement accompanied by advice about marriage and family that now seemed hollow in the face of what had transpired. Victoria Morgan had insisted on perfection in all things, perfect appearance, perfect manners, perfect family image. Today had been anything but perfect. Matthew stood a few feet away, speaking in low tones with the police officers who had arrived to take formal statements about the poison cake. His broad shoulders were rigid with tension, his gestures more constrained than usual, as if he were physically holding himself together through sheer force of will. "He hasn't broken down yet," observed Claire, settling into the chair beside Elizabeth. She had removed her heels, padding barefoot across the grass in a way that would have horrified Victoria. "But he will once this is over, once everyone is gone." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes never leaving her husband's figure. Despite everything, the word husband still sent a small thrill through her. They had completed their vows before the chaos erupted. They were legally and spiritually married. "I know, and I'll be there when he does." "Are you angry?" Claire asked directly, never one to dance around difficult questions. Elizabeth considered the question, carefully turning it over in her mind like a complex puzzle. The day she had planned for 18 months, the celebration that was supposed to mark the beginning of her life with Matthew, had been deliberately sabotaged. By all rights, she should be furious, devastated, perhaps even reconsidering her choices. "Not at Matthew," she said finally. "Never at him. At Andrew, yes, at the situation, definitely. But mostly I'm just sad. Sad that someone could be so consumed by hatred that they go to such lengths. Sad that this day, which should have been about love, became about betrayal instead. Claire reached over to squeeze her friend's hand. That's why you're perfect for him. You know, anyone else would be throwing a tantrum right now, blaming Matthew for his brother's actions. But you see the bigger picture. It's not about seeing the bigger picture. Elizabeth replied softly. It's about understanding that we all have family complications. Mine aren't as dramatic as attempted poisoning, but they exist. My father's affair with his secretary that we all pretend didn't happen. My mother's relentless social climbing that alienated half our relatives. We all have our family shadows. Claire Matthews just happened to step into the light today. Before Claire could respond, Victoria approached her elegant heels, sinking slightly into the grass with each step. Her perfect makeup was now smudged from the tears she had shed in private. Unlike her public persona of steely composure, in unguarded moments, Victoria felt emotions with an intensity that few witnessed. Elizabeth, she began, her voice uncharacteristically hesitant. Your father and I will be leaving soon. Will you be coming with us or staying with? She gestured vaguely toward Matthew, unable to complete the sentence. Elizabeth straightened in her chair, a subtle shift that nonetheless communicated volumes. I'm staying with my husband, Mom. Today is still our wedding day, regardless of what happened. Victoria's eyes widened, slightly genuine shock registering on her features. But surely you can't mean to continue with the arrangements. After everything that's happened, after what his family has done, his brother, Elizabeth corrected firmly, not his family. Andrew made his own choices and Matthew is not responsible for them. But Fuenawernan. Mom, Elizabeth interrupted, her voice gentle but unyielding. We are married. The ceremony was completed before any of this happened. Matthew is my husband and I won't abandon him on what is already the most difficult day of his life. Victoria's expression hardened, the social mask slipping back into place. So you choose him over your own family, over your own safety. I'm not choosing him over you, Elizabeth replied patiently. I'm choosing to honor the commitment I made today. And as for safety, Andrew is in police custody. There's no danger anymore. That you know of, Victoria insisted, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself and glanced around to ensure no lingering guests were witnessing this dispute. Who's to say he didn't have accomplices? Who's to say the Thornton family doesn't harbor other secrets, other threats? Claire snorted, unable to contain herself. With all due respect, Mrs. Morgan, our family has as many skeletons in its closet as any other. The difference is that the Thorntons had the courage to face theirs today in public, rather than sweeping them under imported Persian rugs. Victoria drew herself up to her full height, outrage flashing in her eyes. How dare you speak to me that way? This is a private conversation between me and my daughter. Actually, Elizabeth interjected, rising to stand eye to eye with her mother. It's a conversation about my marriage and my choices, and I've made my choice. Mom, I'm staying with Matthew. For a moment, it seemed Victoria might continue arguing. Her mouth opened, then closed, a variety of emotions chasing across her face. Anger, fear, disappointment, and beneath it all, a mother's concern for her only child. Then with a visible effort, she composed herself, the society matron once again in control. Very well, she said stiffly. I can see your mind is made up, but when you come to your senses, our door will be open. With that, she turned and strode away, her designer heels clicking sharply on the stone path. When she reached it, Elizabeth watched her go, a complicated mixture of emotions playing across her face, love, frustration, and a bone-deep weariness that had nothing to do with the physical demands of the day. She'll come around, Claire said reassuringly. Once she realizes that this isn't going to break you two apart, she'll adjust her expectations. I know, Elizabeth sighed, sinking back into her chair. She just wanted everything to be perfect, the perfect wedding, the perfect union of families, the perfect foundation for her perfect grandchildren. She can't accept that life is messier than that. Speaking of messy, Claire said, nodding toward where Matthew had been speaking with the police. Looks like they're finishing up. The officers were indeed gathering their materials, nodding respectfully to Matthew before turning to leave. As they departed, his shoulders slumped slightly, the first visible crack in the composure he had maintained throughout the ordeal. Elizabeth was on her feet, immediately gathering her voluminous skirts as she moved toward him. Claire remained seated, understanding that this moment belonged to the newlyweds alone. Matthew turned as Elizabeth approached his eyes, finding hers with a desperation that spoke volumes. Without a word, she stepped into his arms and he buried his face in her hair, his body trembling with emotions too complex to name. "I'm sorry," he whispered, the words muffled against her neck. "I'm so sorry, Elizabeth." "Shh." She soothed her hands, making small comforting circles on his back. "You have nothing to be sorry for, nothing. He's my brother," Matthew said, his voice breaking. "My own brother wanted to hurt you, hurt our guests just to get to me. How do I live with that?" Elizabeth pulled back slightly, framing his face with her hands, forcing him to meet her gaze. "You live with it by remembering that his actions are not yours. You live with it by refusing to let his hatred poison what we're building together." "How can you be so calm?" he asked, genuine wonder in his voice. "How can you stand here in the ruins of our wedding day and still look at me like that?" "Like what?" "Like I'm worth it," he said simply. "Like I'm still the man you wanted to marry, even though my family is still your family," she interrupted firmly. "Andrew made terrible choices, yes, but your father stood with us today, and Eleanor stood with us. Claire stood with us. They're your family too, Matthew, and now they're my family as well." At the mention of his aunt, Matthew glanced around the garden, suddenly realizing he hadn't seen her since Andrew had been taken away. "Where is Aunt Eleanor?" "She left with your father," Claire said, approaching them cautiously. "He was not well. The shock, I think she's taken him home and called Dr. Peterson to check on him." Concern creased Matthew's brow. Though their relationship had been strained at times by business disagreements, he loved his father deeply and understood how devastating Andrew's actions must have been for the older man. "I should go to him. He may not show it, but this will have broken him in ways we can't see." "Tomorrow," Elizabeth said gently, laying a hand on his chest. "Tonight you need rest, we both do. Your father has Aunt Eleanor, and that's the best medicine he could have right now." Matthew nodded slowly, acknowledging the wisdom in her words. His father and his aunt had a bond that transcended conventional understanding. They were more than siblings. They were spiritual partners, each grounding in the other through life's turbulence. "What now?" he asked quietly. "Where do we go from here?" It was a question with layers, practical, emotional, spiritual. Where do they physically go tonight with the elaborate wedding night plans now in disarray? Where do they go emotionally after such profound betrayal? Where did they go as a couple, their beginnings so thoroughly disrupted? Elizabeth considered for a moment, then turned to Claire. "The honeymoon suite at the Four Seasons, is it still available?" Claire nodded. "Everything's still arranged as planned. The staff is awaiting your arrival whenever you're ready." "Then that's where we go," Elizabeth said decisively. "We go on our honeymoon. We begin our marriage. We refuse to let this day define us." Matthew stared at her in wonder. "You still want to—" "I still want to be your wife," she said simply. "I still want to build a life with you. That hasn't changed." The raw vulnerability in his expression nearly broke her heart. This proud, capable man reduced to uncertainty by his brother's actions, it strengthened her resolve to reclaim what they could of this day. "I need to get changed," she said softly. "I'll meet you back here in 30 minutes and we'll go together." As she turned to leave to find her maid of honor, who had stored a change of clothes for her, a familiar warmth pressed against her legs. Duke looked up at her, his intelligent eyes somehow understanding the significance of the moment. Elizabeth knelt heedless of her gown and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. "You're coming too," she whispered. "Our guardian angel deserves a night in a fancy hotel, don't you think?" Matthew smiled, a small, fragile thing, but a smile nonetheless. "He can have the whole suite if he wants. We owe him that much." As Elizabeth departed to change, Matthew found himself alone with Claire and Duke in the fading light. The garden, which hours earlier had been a vision of wedding perfection, now bore the scars of their disrupted celebration: abandoned chairs, half-dismantled decorations, the ghostly absence of the wedding cake that had been removed as evidence. "Will you be all right?" Claire asked quietly. Really all right, not just the brave face you were showing for Elizabeth's sake. Matthew considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. The events of the day had shaken him to his core. Not just Andrew's betrayal, but the realization of how deeply his brother's resentment ran, how close they had come to tragedy. Not today, he admitted, loosening his bow tie with fingers that still trembled slightly. Maybe not tomorrow, but eventually, yes. With her, I think I can be. She's extraordinary, Claire said, genuine admiration in her voice. I've known Elizabeth since we were children, but I've never been more proud of her than I am today. I don't deserve her, Matthew said softly. Nobody deserves someone else. Claire countered, her voice carrying the conviction that made her formidable in courtrooms. Love isn't about deserving, it's about choosing and being chosen. And despite everything, she's still choosing you. Accept that gift, Matthew. Don't diminish it by questioning whether you deserve it. Her words hung in the air between them, challenging and comforting at once. After a moment, Matthew nodded, accepting the wisdom in them. I should change, he said, glancing down at his now rumpled tuxedo. Will you stay with Duke until I return? Of course, Claire replied. We'll be right here. As Matthew walked away, Claire settled onto a nearby chair, Duke resting his head on her lap. She stroked the dog's fur absently, her mind replaying the day's events. You knew, didn't you? She murmured to the dog. You sensed something wrong before any of us did. People think animals are simpler than humans, but sometimes I wonder if you just see more clearly. Duke's ears twitched at her words, his dark eyes gazing up at her with an intelligence that seemed to transcend species. Take care of them, Claire continued softly. They're going to need you in the days ahead. The dog's tail thumped against the ground in what seemed like agreement, and Claire smiled despite the heaviness in her heart. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew that Matthew and Elizabeth would face them together with this extraordinary dog by their side. And perhaps in the end, that was all anyone could really ask for. Not perfection, but presence. Not an unblemished beginning, but an unwavering commitment to walk the path together, no matter how unexpected its twists and turns might be. The Four Seasons presidential suite occupied the entire top floor of the hotel, offering panoramic views of Boston that transformed the historic cityscape into a glittering tapestry of lights. Floor-to-ceiling windows lined the living area, creating the illusion that one could step directly into the twilight sky. The suite had been prepared meticulously for the newlyweds. Champagne chilling in silver buckets, rose petals scattered across the Italian marble floors. The bedroom bathed in the soft glow of dozens of candles. But none of these romantic touches registered as Matthew and Elizabeth entered, both still trapped in the surreal aftermath of their wedding day. They had changed out of their ceremonial attire. Matthew now in simple linen trousers and a white shirt, Elizabeth in a flowing ivory dress that whispered against her skin. They looked like any other wealthy couple checking into a luxury hotel except for the shadows in their eyes and the German shepherd padding quietly beside them. It's beautiful, Elizabeth said softly, taking in the suite's opulence with a detached appreciation. In another life, the life they had planned, she would have gasped with delight at the extravagance, would have twirled across the marble floors in her husband's arms. Now the lavish surroundings felt almost inappropriate, a jarring contrast to the emotional devastation they carried with them. Do you want something to eat? Matthew asked, gesturing to the elaborate fruit and cheese platter that had been arranged on the dining table. You haven't had anything all day. The thought of food made Elizabeth's stomach turn, but she recognized the concern behind his question. Maybe some tea. She suggested something simple. Matthew nodded, grateful for the concrete task. He moved to the in-suite kitchen where the staff had stocked everything they might need during their stay. As he busied himself with the electric kettle, Elizabeth wandered to the windows, drawn to the city lights, blinking like earthbound stars. Boston spread before her, indifferent to the personal dramas played out within its boundaries. Somewhere out there, Andrew sat in a police cell, his elaborate revenge plot in ruins. Somewhere else, William Thornton wrestled with the knowledge that his firstborn son had been capable of such malice. And in countless homes across the city, guests from their wedding were recounting the day's shocking events, turning a private tragedy into public spectacle. "It will be all over the society pages tomorrow," she said, not turning from the window. "Prominent Boston family torn apart at wedding of the year. Thornton heir's brother arrested for attempted poisoning. Does that bother you?" Matthew asked, pausing in his tea preparation. Elizabeth considered the question. Her job as a corporate attorney had taught her to compartmentalize, to separate personal feelings from professional analysis. But this situation defied such neat categorization. "Not for myself," she said finally. "But for you, for your father, yes, it bothers me. No one deserves to have their pain turned into entertainment." Matthew approached carrying 2 steaming cups of herbal tea. He handed one to Elizabeth, their fingers brushing in a moment of simple intimacy that felt like an anchor in the storm. "We'll weather it," he said quietly. "The journalists will find another scandal soon enough, and ours will become yesterday's news. Besides, you know our society. No one will mention it to our faces, even though everyone will be whispering about it behind our backs." The wry observation drew an unexpected laugh from Elizabeth, the sound surprising them both. Boston high society in a nutshell, she agreed, taking a sip of the fragrant tea. Polite facades over seething gossip. They fell silent, standing side by side before the windows, sipping their tea and watching the city below. Duke had settled on a plush rug near their feet. His vigilance relaxed, but not entirely abandoned. "I keep thinking about what might have happened," Matthew said suddenly, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "If Duke hadn't warned us, if the cake had been served, people could have died, Elizabeth. Our guests, our family members, maybe even you or me. But they didn't," she reminded him gently. "No one was harmed." "Because of a dog," Matthew said, glancing down at Duke with a mixture of wonder and gratitude. All of Andrew's careful planning undone by a dog who somehow sensed danger before any human could. "Maybe it's not so surprising," Elizabeth mused. "Dogs don't get distracted by appearances, by social niceties. They don't care about status or reputation. They simply see truth." Matthew looked at her, really looked at her for what felt like the first time since the chaos had begun. Her face was bare of makeup, now, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes heavy with exhaustion, but still clear, still present, in this moment stripped of the wedding's pageantry and pretense. She was simply Elizabeth, the woman who had chosen to stand beside him, even as his world fractured. "I don't know how to thank you," he said softly. Her brow furrowed slightly. "Thank me for what?" "For staying, for not running away, when you saw the worst my family could do. For still being here, still being willing to be my wife, even after everything." Elizabeth set her teacup on a nearby table and turned to face him fully. "Do you remember what Reverend Mills said during the ceremony before everything went wrong? He talked about marriage as a covenant, not a contract. A contract is broken when conditions become unfavorable, but a covenant endures precisely because conditions become unfavorable." She took his hands in hers, her touch warm and steady. "This wasn't in our plans, Matthew. This wasn't the beginning we wanted, but it's the beginning we have. And I made a promise today to stand with you through better or worse. I didn't expect worse to come quite so quickly. But here we are." Matthew's throat tightened with emotion. "Here we are," he echoed. "And here we'll stay," she continued, "together. Because that's what marriage is, 2 people choosing each other again and again, especially when it's difficult." The simple truth of her words breached the careful walls he had constructed around his emotions. Tears filled his eyes, and he didn't try to hide them. "I love you," he whispered, the words inadequate, but all he had to offer. "I love you too," she replied, reaching up to brush the tears from his cheeks. "And that's enough. That's always been enough." She drew his face down to hers, their lips meeting in a kiss that tasted of salt and tea and promises. It wasn't the passionate embrace they had imagined for their wedding night, but something deeper, something forged in the crucible of shared trial. When they separated, Matthew rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "What do we do now?" he asked, echoing his earlier question, but with a different quality now. less lost, more open. Elizabeth's lips curved in a small smile. "Now," she said softly, "we begin, not the beginning. We planned, but our beginning nonetheless." She led him away from the windows, away from the city's watchful eyes toward the bedroom, where candles flickered in welcome. Duke followed for a few steps, then settled deliberately in the living room, as if understanding that some spaces belong to humans alone. In the soft candlelight, they found each other anew, not as bride and groom playing prescribed roles, but as Elizabeth and Matthew, two people navigating the unexpected terrain of their shared life. Their touches were gentle, exploratory, sometimes hesitant, but always honest. They made love not with the frantic passion of newlyweds, but with the deliberate tenderness of survivors. Each caress an affirmation of presence, of choosing, of enduring. Afterward, lying tangled in the luxurious sheets, Elizabeth's head resting on Matthew's chest, they spoke in hushed tones of practical things, what to tell colleagues who would ask about the wedding, whether to proceed with the planned 2-week honeymoon in the Maldives, how to support William through the aftermath. One day at a time, Matthew murmured, his fingers tracing idle patterns on Elizabeth's bare shoulder. "We'll figure it out one day at a time." She nodded against his chest, her eyes growing heavy with exhaustion. The day's emotional toll was finally claiming its due, pulling her towards sleep, despite the 1,000 thoughts still circling in her mind. "Rest," Matthew whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Tomorrow will come soon enough." As Elizabeth drifted into sleep, Matthew remained awake, holding her close, as if she might dissolve into mist if he relaxed his vigilance. The candles burned low, casting elongated shadows across the walls of the unfamiliar room. From the living area came the soft sound of Duke's steady breathing, a comforting reminder of the dog's protective presence. Despite the luxury surrounding them, despite Elizabeth's warm weight against him, Matthew couldn't escape the cold reality of his brother's betrayal. The questions haunted him. Had he somehow contributed to Andrew's bitterness? Could he have prevented this if he'd been more attentive, more understanding of his brother's feelings? And the most terrifying question of all, what if this was only the beginning of Andrew's vengeance, not its culmination? "Stop," Elizabeth murmured, her voice thick with sleep. She placed a hand over his heart, which had begun to race with anxiety. "I can hear you thinking, whatever it is, we'll face it tomorrow." Matthew covered her hand with his own, anchoring himself in her touch. "How do you always know what I need to hear?" "Because I know you," she replied simply, already slipping back toward sleep. "Better than anyone. Better perhaps than you know yourself." The truth of her words settled around him like a protective cloak. She did know him, his strengths, his weaknesses, his fears, and still she had chosen him. Still she remained. As the last candle flickered and died, casting the room into darkness, Matthew finally allowed himself to close his eyes. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, family to face, decisions to make, a brother's betrayal to process. But tonight, in this moment, he was not alone. He had Elizabeth, he had Duke, and perhaps that was all the foundation they needed to build upon. Their wedding day had not been what they planned, but their marriage, Matthew realized with sudden clarity, might be stronger for having faced adversity from its very inception. Forged in crisis rather than cocooned in celebration, their bond had already weathered a storm that might have destroyed a less resilient connection. One day at a time, he whispered into the darkness an affirmation and a promise. And somewhere in the city below, life continued its relentless forward motion, indifferent to personal tragedy, offering tomorrow with all its unknown possibilities, all its potential for healing, for growth, for beginning anew. 3 months later, the Boston fall was in full glory, painting the trees of the public garden in fiery reds and burnished golds. Elizabeth and Matthew walked slowly along the pathways, Duke trotting contentedly ahead of them on his leash. The German shepherd had become something of a local celebrity after the news of the wedding incident broke with the Boston Globe dubbing him the poison-detecting wonder dog. In a feature article that had both amused and mortified the Thorntons, the story had indeed dominated the society pages for weeks. Though the family's connections had managed to keep some of the more lurid details private. Andrew had been charged with attempted assault rather than attempted murder, a legal distinction that carried a significantly lighter sentence, but still ensured he would face consequences for his actions. William had refused to use the family's influence to further reduce the charges, a stance that had surprised many who knew him as a man who prioritized the Thornton name above all else. "Dad's coming for dinner tomorrow," Matthew said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. "He mentioned bringing some papers he wants us to look over." Elizabeth nodded, her hand warm in his despite the autumn chill. "The foundation documents?" "I think so. He seems determined to move quickly with it." The Thornton Safe Food Initiative, a foundation dedicated to researching and implementing better detection methods for food contamination, had been William's idea, his way of creating something positive from the tragedy that had nearly befallen their family. The irony was not lost on any of them, but the project had given William purpose during the difficult months following Andrew's arrest. "It's good for him," Elizabeth said softly. "Gives him something to focus on besides Andrew's trial." Matthew nodded, his eyes following Duke as the dog paused to inspect an interesting scent on the pathway. The trial was scheduled for the following month, and while Andrew had offered to plead guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, the proceedings would still require testimony from family members, a prospect that loomed over them all. "Has your mother called this week?" Matthew asked, deliberately changing the subject. Elizabeth smiled wryly. "Twice. She's still hoping we'll agree to a proper reception for her friends who missed the original celebration, Waxen on Arenum." "And what did you tell her?" "The same thing I've told her every week for the past 3 months, that when we're ready to celebrate again, we'll do it our way, not as a do-over, orchestrated for her social circle." Victoria had eventually come around, as Claire had predicted, though her acceptance was more pragmatic than heartfelt. She had realized that Elizabeth was immovable in her commitment to Matthew, and rather than risk alienating her only child, she had shifted to trying to fix the situation in ways that aligned with her need for social propriety. "I'm proud of you," Matthew said, squeezing her hand gently. "Standing up to your mother isn't easy." Elizabeth laughed softly. "Easier than facing down a poisoned wedding cake." It was a measure of their healing that they could joke about it now, at least occasionally. The trauma remained surfacing, sometimes in unexpected moments. A hesitation before taking a bite of food in a restaurant, a flash of panic when Duke barked at something unfamiliar, but they were learning to live with it, to integrate it into their shared narrative without allowing it to define them. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked suddenly, the question that had been hovering at the edges of his consciousness for months, finally finding voice. "Marrying into all this mess." Elizabeth stopped walking, turning to face him fully. The autumn sunlight caught in her hair, turning it to spun gold. And for a moment, Matthew saw her again, as she had been on their wedding day, radiant, determined, wholly his. "Not for a single second," she said firmly. "Do I wish things had happened differently? Of course, do I wish your brother hadn't harbored such resentment that he was willing to harm innocent people? Absolutely, but regret marrying you? Never." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers warm against his cheek. "We've built something strong, Matthew. Something real, and I think, in a strange way, we have Andrew to thank for that." "Thank Andrew?" Matthew repeated, confusion evident in his voice. Elizabeth nodded, her expression thoughtful. "If our wedding had been perfect, the fairy tale day we planned, we might have started our marriage believing that's what life should be. Picture perfect, Instagram ready, without conflict or challenge. But instead we started with the worst possible day and we survived it. Together, everything else feels manageable by comparison." Matthew considered her words, seeing the truth in them. They had indeed approached each subsequent challenge, from the media frenzy to family tensions to the everyday irritations of married life, with a perspective shaped by that first terrible day. If they could weather a poisoned wedding cake, they could certainly handle disagreements about household chores or conflicting work schedules. "When did you get so wise?" he asked, smiling down at her. "I've always been wise," she replied with mock gravity. "You're just finally noticing." Duke barked suddenly, pulling at his leash with unexpected urgency. Matthew tensed instinctively, his body remembering the last time the dog had shown such alarm. Elizabeth's hand tightened in his, the same memory clearly flashing through her mind. But Duke wasn't growling or showing signs of distress. His tail wagged vigorously, his posture excited rather than defensive. Following the dog's gaze, they saw the cause of his enthusiasm. A small girl in a red coat who was pointing at Duke and tugging at her mother's hand. "Look, Mommy," the girl exclaimed. "It's the hero dog from the newspaper." Matthew and Elizabeth exchanged glances, tension melting into relief and then amusement. Duke's celebrity status continued to surprise them, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Boston loved its local heroes, especially the four-legged variety. "May we pet him?" the mother asked, approaching cautiously. "Emma here has been collecting articles about him. She wants to be a veterinarian." "Of course," Elizabeth said, smiling at the little girl whose eyes were wide with admiration. "Duke loves children." As Emma patted Duke's head with reverent care, her mother turned to Matthew and Elizabeth. "We didn't mean to intrude, but when we saw you, well, your story made such an impression on us. The way that dog saved everyone at your wedding, it's remarkable." Matthew knelt beside Duke, giving the dog an affectionate scratch behind the ears. "He's the remarkable one. We just got lucky having him in our lives." "And each other," Elizabeth added softly, her hand resting on Matthew's shoulder. The mother smiled, something knowing in her expression. "That's the real story, isn't it? Not just the dog, but the two of you facing something so terrible on what should have been the happiest day of your lives, and still choosing to move forward together." It was a perspective they hadn't considered, that their story might be meaningful to others, not just as a scandalous headline, but as an example of resilience, of commitment, tested by fire and emerging stronger. After the mother and daughter moved on, Duke trotting proudly after his moment of recognition, Matthew and Elizabeth continued their walk. The afternoon light had softened, casting long shadows across the park's winding paths. "She's right, you know," Matthew said after a while. "The real story is us. Not the poisoning, not Andrew, not even Duke's heroics, just us choosing each other every day, especially on the days when it's hardest," Elizabeth said, completing his thought as she so often did. "That's what makes it love, not just romance." They reached the small bridge over the pond, pausing to watch a family of ducks glide across the water surface. Duke sat at their feet, his mission as protector momentarily set aside as he basked in the peaceful afternoon. "I think we should go," Matthew said suddenly. "When go where, Vietnam?" "The Maldives, the honeymoon we postponed. I think it's time." Elizabeth studied his face, searching for signs of doubt or obligation. Finding none, she smiled. "Are you sure with the trial coming up?" "I'm sure," he said firmly. "Andrew has already taken enough from us. I won't let him take this too." The decision felt right, a declaration of intent to reclaim what had been disrupted, to continue building the life they had planned, despite the unexpected detour they had been forced to navigate. "Besides," Matthew added with a playful glint in his eye, "Duke deserves a vacation too. I hear the Maldives are very dog-friendly." Elizabeth laughed, the sound light and free in a way it hadn't been since before the wedding. "A honeymoon with our canine chaperone. How romantic." He earned his place," Matthew grinned. "And I'm not going anywhere without our faithful poison detector." "Our guardian angel," Elizabeth corrected, bending to ruffle Duke's fur. The dog looked up at them with what could only be described as adoration, his tail sweeping the ground in contentment. As they turned to head home, the setting sun painting the Boston skyline in hues of gold and rose, Matthew felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would not be easy, Andrew's trial family healing the inevitable challenges of marriage, but they would face it together, one day at a time. Their beginning had not been what they planned, but perhaps it had been exactly what they needed. A test of their commitment, a forge for their resilience. A reminder that life's most precious gifts often come disguised as its greatest challenges. With Elizabeth's hand in his and Duke leading the way, Matthew walked forward into the gathering dusk, not toward the picture-perfect future they had once imagined, but toward something infinitely more valuable. a future built on truth, tested by fire, and strengthened by the knowledge that together they could weather whatever storms might come. And in the end, perhaps that was the greatest gift of all.